So today I want to do something. I'm very bad with titles, as you know. But if I had the title today, I would talk about this as the language culture context. And I'm going to do this for a while. We really want to see the influence of language and the cultural context on the way some things were written.
Yes.
And what you're going to discover is some of the things which have brought the most controversy. It's purely because there has completely been a disconnect between the language and the cultural context in the initial writing with ours presently today. I thought, we'll start with the Jewish Bible and then we'll go into the New Testament and we'll look at some interesting things, but that won't be today. I don't know if it will be next week before we go into the New Testament. I do maintain when I'm teaching people, I heavily teach a lot from the Old Testament these days because I discovered that in the New Testament, for lack of a better phraseology, you have commentaries on the Old Testament. You have summaries. You have things, as one man would call it, that are heavily codified.
Yeah.
Because what you must know, the New Testament teachers, the apostles, Jesus, none of them used their books as their teaching material in their schools, in their classes, in their churches, in their gatherings.
Yeah.
They never used them for references. Think about these as after materials written down because some degree of teaching has gone ahead. Many of them are situational. Many of them are reactionary. Somebody asked a question, we're just responding to it.
Yeah.
But what we have done today is to actually carry that and make it our primary and only theology we're living by. And I find that that's a bit dangerous. But also I find that there are very many things in the New Testament that are mentioned, but they have a heavy background, or their theology is actually in the Old Testament books. And when we are unaware of that, we oftentimes get the wrong thing, or we oftentimes don't get what the author intended to communicate. And that we cannot get what God wants to speak to us. So in that language cultural context, remember I said that, and I've showed you this, that the aspect of inspiration, you have a divine human literature. God and man, hand in hand, to bring this thing to us. So that's why we're talking about language, that's why we're talking about culture. These things do not in any way diminish the supernatural hand of God. They do not. In fact, they affirm it. But oftentimes we think that this is actually that they are contradictory. Okay? So I want to look at something today. Some of us may be aware, some of us may not be aware. But there's this theology called the gap theory. I don't know if you've heard about it, the gap theory. I think we should start there. So basically, if you don't know what the gap theory is, let me just give you a little background. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 to 3. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 to 3. I'll read this one in the King James because the King James will bring out what I need to. It says, "In the beginning God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters, and God said, Let there be light, and there was light." So for those of us who don't know the gap theory, hypothesis or doctrine, let me just give you some kind of a background. Now, the gap theory is an hypothesis proposed by, some theologians or some Bible scholars, a small group really. And they advocate for the fact that, the earth is, billions or at least millions of years old. And believe that a vast majority of the earth's history can be condensed into an ambiguous gap. which they place between the first two verses of the Bible, verse 1 and verse 2 of Genesis chapter 1. So anyway, let me first give you some kind of background. Now, there's something which there's what they are called creationists, okay? And in creationists, there are like two major groups. You have young earth and old earth. Eh? Okay. Young earthers and old earthers. I don't know if you heard something about like that. Now, for people, let me just try to simplify this. For people who look at Genesis 1 as a literal creation of the world from scratch, young earthers, the earth is about 6,000 years to 10,000 years. Now, the issue with that, scientists believe the earth is millions or billions of years old. Okay? So some of the old earthers and the creationists, for one reason or another. Now, this may be one of the reasons. On what may be like on partly the scientific side to reconcile that, they can propose that the earth is all these millions of years old. However, that lost time, allow me to say this, which may not be accounted for, happens between Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 and Genesis chapter 1 verse 2. So, Genesis chapter 1 verse 1, God created heaven and the earth. It was perfect. It was good. Okay? Then, the next thing we see in verse 2 is that the earth was without form and void. So they're saying there's some kind of like a pre-Adamic fall, or some kind of, cosmic disaster happened between verse 1 and verse 2. Something in a prehistoric era. Where a number of plants, a number of animals that lived and flourished, they became extinct. Including dinosaurs. Right? So, in that time. So they're saying this gap is responsible for those geological findings of modern science, which have been interpreted by that lengthy prehistoric era. Of course, this is in a contradiction with what you may look at in the Bible, but the answer to that, like I've told you, is that something happened between that. Maybe, like scientists, maybe a large asteroid hit the earth. I don't know, some of the things of that. Or a global flood, like in the days of Noah. But some kind of catastrophic event made the earth without form and void. So that's more on the scientific side. The other is maybe more on the spiritual side, but it is also a gap. Okay? So they say that what happened is that in that gap, that's where Satan fell. And I think this is a more popular, opinion you've had. And some of this you find it to think the Dake Annotated Bible is one of those Bibles that, perhaps made this theory even more popular. So that Satan's fall, which is described in Ezekiel 28, verse 13 to 17, or Isaiah 14, verse 12, or Luke chapter 10, 18, when Jesus said, I saw Satan fall like lightning. Yeah. It took place in that ambiguous gap, that Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2. So the argument is the fall of Satan might have caused such a devastation upon the planet, and then it was necessary for God to restore creation in Genesis chapter 1, verse 3, in order to continue his work on the earth. Now, to posit that kind of theory, the reading of Genesis 1:1 up to 1:3, you must read it as, in the beginning God created heavens and the earth, right? And then you put there, and the earth became without form and void. Okay, so I really like, so that it forms some kind of narrative sequence, okay? Everything is perfect. But then, in the next verse, it became without form and void. Even if the original doesn't exactly read like that. Now, this all, like I said, has to hinge on the fact that Genesis 1:1, 1:2, 1:3 is a narrative sequence. What I mean by that is that heaven and earth was created, then the earth became without form and void, then the earth became without form and void, darkness was upon the face of the deep, the Spirit of God was upon the face of the waters, and then God said, let there be light. And I think, really, if we're being honest, many of us are really reading that like that. May have never heard of a gap theory, but at least we read it like that.
Yeah.
Things were created. Sometimes you ask yourself, but what happened in verse 2? I don't want to know. Let me just go ahead. All I know is that God is a creator, which is wonderful, really. Now, so this is where I want everybody to pay some attention. First of all, I will flow it together. First, ask me, because now we're going to go into the language part. Right? We're going to go into the language part. And everybody who's listening to me, please pay attention. Like one preacher says, this is the time whereby if you've been dozing, just sleep. just rest. Enter into your rest. Now, what I'm going to talk about is something, is a rule of Hebrew grammar. Remember where we came from, okay? Remember we're looking at language,
yes,
cultural context, and how it affects interpretation of what was written. And this is what we're going to start from. Now, I've thought of the simplest way to explain this, and it's going to be simple.
Amen.
Now, in Hebrew grammar, according to Hebrew grammar, there is a way of denoting when events which are in sequence are happening, and there is a way in Hebrew grammar where they show if a sequence is stopping or taking a pause. Okay? Now, part of this, we have a limitation because, this is purely audio. I cannot show you so, but it's going to be quite easy. Now, simply put, in the narrating of a sequence, there is a prefix, which is a one-letter conjunction in Hebrew called vav. Vav. V-A-V, but it's W-A-W, but they read it as vav. Okay? That little prefix is attached to verbs that occur in succession. And that in Hebrew grammar is called the verb consecutive. The verb consecutive. Okay? So I'm going to start with the technical of talking about it, and I'm going to simplify it. Now, but that prefix is called a verb conjunction. It's just take a little thing like it. It's called a verb conjunction. Now, if there is a narrative sequence and one event is following each other, that verb conjunction is attached to a verb.
Okay.
But if the narrative is going to be disjointed or paused or stopped, it is attached to a noun.
The prefix.
The verb. Prefix, yeah. That verb that verb conjunction. If it's attached to a noun at the beginning, it shows that the narrative is being what? Broken or paused. So in other words, what I'm saying next is not following. It's not a sequence of what I'm saying before. In simple terms, if I put it in simple terms, now the problem is this conjunction is not translated in English. So in the English translation, there is no way of translating it. But sometimes they can add a word like and or now. Eh?
Yeah.
Now, for instance, so if you have, let's use an example how King James puts it. If and appears first and it is followed by a verb, it's followed by a verb and a noun, it means that you have a wonderful. Yeah. If the and happens, then you have a noun. It shows that it's the author's way of telling you, first pause. Let me tell you something. Then
We can get back to that line of thought.
we can move on. So in other words, what is happening next is not a narrative sequence of what I've just said
Yes, sir.
before. In fact, so if that verb conjunction is on a noun that begins, it interrupts the sequence.
The sequence.
Yeah? And in that case, they call it a verb disjunction. This is when they're teaching Hebrew language, they talk about these things. Right? I think that went well.
Yes, sir.
Now, okay, so now let's look at what we have. So in other words, when you look at that King James, you have, in the beginning, God created heaven and the earth.
And the
Then it says, and the earth. Now, if you're somewhere and you have a Bible study tool, you can look in the interlinear. You can look in the interlinear and you see what you have. You'll find that the word and didn't have it didn't have a corresponding Hebrew word for it. Okay, so the translator is trying to find a way of making the syntax to make sense, the way sentences are arranged. Okay, so let's go at it. In the beginning, God created heaven and the earth. Now, what do you have next? And the earth. So at the beginning there, you have that.
And. So the and becomes that prefix. The verb.
But which
So
one?
now what we need to determine is it coming before a noun or
Or
a
a
verb?
verb. Yes.
And here in verse 2 it says, and the earth.
Which is,
The earth, which is a noun.
thank you. So that is a verb disjunction.
Okay.
In other words, in the beginning, God created. So first pause this.
there.
Now let me show you.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Okay. So
Good.
the and is breaking the sequence we are
Yeah.
having in verse 1.
Yeah. So the and is breaking that sequence. So you have, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of
The
it.
deep.
Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters, and
God said.
so you have an action there, and God said. Okay. So anyway, this is what is happening. If you look into a good Bible application, and you check where you have that verb with a verb in chapter 1, okay? The first 2 verses don't.
Yeah.
Now, from verse 3, going all the way, you will start to notice it. You know why?
The verb with a
Yeah.
verb. Yeah.
The verb. Because now, the creation sequence
Is taking place.
is going to take place in order.
Wow.
Wonderful. I landed on one by mistake. It's all over the Hebrew grammar, right? In Exodus, just actually saw this in passing. When you go to Exodus, and you don't have to first go to Exodus to find this again, but I think it will help. So in Exodus chapter 2, at the end, it says, this is ESV, God saw that the people of Israel and God, let me read King James. Okay. God looked upon the children of Israel, and God had respect unto them, right? Then when you go to verse 3, it says, now Moses kept the flock of Jethro his father. So just before that, right there at chapter 1 at the beginning, you have the disjunction. So in other words, when you finish chapter 2, verse 25, chapter 3 verse 1 is not the very next thing. You get? So he's breaking the narrative sequence too. So it's something which appears in
The
Hebrew grammar,
Bible.
the way it was constructed. Now, if we just went by just the grammatical construction, remember, the very basis of which the gap theory hinges on is that those 3 verses must be a sequence.
A sequence.
You get it? In the beginning, God created heaven and earth, and then the earth, okay, was without form and void. So the gap here, that something happened to make the earth without form.
Verse 1 and verse 2 to make
Without form and
this
void,
function.
okay? Then
Yeah.
God started to create again. So if you already disjoint that in that narrative sequence, then it implies that you're not dealing with a chronology.
Yeah.
So that's just the grammatical part. Before I go ahead,
well, no, I think we can go ahead, Apostle. Maybe just to highlight, in case you have any comments, any responses, any feedback really that you'd like us to receive. I'll just quickly read for you a WhatsApp number where you can drop that message. The number is +256 764 001 591. +256 764 001 591. Yes, sir.
Okay, so if we leave the grammar, because for some people that may not suffice, that's just academic. Okay. As though, anyway. Well, let me tell you, some of the people who put the Bible together, some of the smartest people. Think about it like this. The people who wrote this Bible are scholars.
100%.
They are scholars.
Yeah.
And that's why you may not find any lay person as an author. If any book of the Bible, I'll just leave that to the people. There is no lay person. So anyway, so think about it, something like that. Now, that doctrine has tremendous ramifications. It has it has huge implications.
Yeah.
But if you look at the root of it, it is strengthened by a misconstruing of a grammar, because maybe we just took it directly from the English. Now, I'm going to tell you more things about this. But first of all, let's look at some of the arguments for the gap theory, okay, from the rest of the Bible. One of those, of course, I've told you that there's a belief that Satan fell there.
Yeah.
Now, one of the reasons is because there is this question of, and many of these things we shall deal with in time. Where did the serpent? Now, of course, people say the serpent is Satan in Genesis chapter 3, even though the Bible doesn't
explicitly
say that there. You have to go up to Revelation.
Yes, sir.
Where John will say that old serpent, the devil, Satan, is this.
Yes,
Now, before you say I'm a cult, I'm not saying. We'll get into that. Okay? So there is this thinking of what was the serpent doing in Eden?
In the Garden of Eden.
When did he fall?
Yes.
Where did evil come from? So many times, people's desire to fill in those gaps is what also further strengthens their belief that perhaps there is actually something happening there. Now, let me deal with one. There is Revelation chapter 12. In Revelation chapter 12, they point to the fact that this is when it happened. I'm going to read from verse 1 up to verse 5. And you're going to read? Go ahead. Okay.
That's Revelation chapter 12, verse 1 to 5. Verse 1, and a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pains and the agony of giving birth. Verse 3, and another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads 7 diadems. His tail swept down 1/3 of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. Verse 5, she gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was caught up to God and to his throne.
And you see what I'm saying now. If a person reads this in Revelation chapter 12, you're going to just come back in your 2023 mind.
Yes.
Planets, what? But you see, majority of this imagery is Old Testament imagery. Okay, but maybe one time we'll talk about the Revelator. But let me just stay with what we're dealing with now. So they said this is when the devil fell, or This is when the chaos happened,
Yeah.
right, in heaven, which caused the tohu vabohu. We're going to come there. But in verse 4 and verse 5 of that chapter, it tells us that what prompts the war in heaven is not Satan or something that
Yes,
happened in the creation. No,
yes.
it was the birth of the son or the birth of the child, which is actually, this text is speaking about the incarnation.
The birth of the Messiah.
Yes, the birth of the Messiah. So that Revelation 12 isn't some pre-Adamic or pre-fall or fall of Satan, but it's actually that. And like I also mentioned I think it was last week or the first time, that many people think the origin of all the evil in the world is based only on Genesis chapter 3.
Chapter 3.
But
yeah.
no, but there are two other very critical rebellions that you see there in the book of Genesis that are very responsible for many of the things we are doing, and they have, and they preempt the redemption work of the Christ. And you find that what Christ accomplishes in his redemptive work deals with
Wow.
all those things, but we must take them individually. Then there is a second argument. Another argument, may not be the second one. You know, it says, without form and void is the Hebrew tohu vabohu. Tohu vabohu. And they say that tohu vabohu occurs elsewhere in the Bible. And when it occurs elsewhere in the Bible, there are elements of judgment. And yes, rightly so. For instance, in Isaiah 34 verse 11, and Jeremiah 4:23. Those were both tohu vabohu was used, and Isaiah 34, but the hawk and the porcupine shall possess it, the owl, the raven shall dwell in it. He shall stretch the line of confusion, that word over it, and the plumb line of emptiness. I think the King James maintains the other words because they're the ones we're using. And then Jeremiah 4:23, this is ESV. I looked on the earth, and behold, it was without form and void, and to the heavens, and they had no light. So this is that, Genesis 1:2 kind of speaking. Now, what you must know is, just because the context in Genesis, in these texts, Jeremiah 4 and Isaiah 34, is about judgment, does not in any way imply that also what you heard in Genesis 1:2 is a case of judgment. Okay? Well, what about the darkness? Right? The darkness, for us, it communicates something sinister or something evil, something terrible. But then you find some texts in the Bible which can give you some issues. 1 Kings chapter 8 verse 12. The Lord said that he would dwell in thick darkness. So this is something like that. Now, if the Lord is dwelling in thick darkness, what about that? This was about Solomon, the dedication of the temple, and also in 2 Chronicles chapter 6 verse 1. So 1 Kings 8:12 and 2 Chronicles 6:1. Then Solomon said, the Lord had said he would dwell in thick darkness. And then 2 Samuel 22 verse 12. Okay. Now, so, and of course here it is showing about, God reveals when he reveals. If he wants to be seen, he will be seen. It's not talking about that God enjoys darkness. So it's something sinister is not in view here. Now, so the presence of darkness there is not an argument in the defense that, Satan, is fighting, and that's why there's all this kind of darkness that God now wants to recreate from. Right?
Yes, sir.
So what is it? Let me just say some of these things. One of the things you must know about just the creation account in Genesis 1. It is not a narration of science.
Yes.
Right? The science of Moses' day was not in any way advanced
Absolutely.
to the science we have now. Moses, if as we read the Bible, we put it in our heads that Moses is not trying to teach us a science lesson. He's trying to communicate something. It's the creation in Genesis chapter 1 is not a creation of matter we think about. Now you must so he's communicating to a different context. He's not writing to 2023. He's writing to people in the ancient Near East.
A particular audience.
A particular time. There is a way they perceive or perceived things, and he was trying to communicate to them in that time. Many of those things we shall get into. Okay? So, first of all, you must first divorce the science kind of thinking and mentality from your head and look at it from something else. Now, do I have time to get into this? In fact, let me just try to go to the end of this. Maybe we'll look at creation. If you actually look into the original Hebrew, that first line, Genesis 1:1, is seven words. That was on purpose. Okay? Now, in the original Hebrew, right? If one technical thing is enough, but think about it like this. The actual translation in the original Hebrew reads something like, when God began to create the heavens and the earth. In fact, there's a Bible translation which is called the Jewish Publication Society, the JPS. It's what is used by why do I keep forgetting that sect? It's called what? Is it Judaism? Is it the word I want to use? Anyway, sorry. So there's a Jewish translation, the JPS. They translated direct from the original text and they put it in English. The JPS actually reads Genesis 1:1 as, when God began to create the heavens and the earth. Now, the New Revised Standard Version also tried to, but they were caught in the middle because these verses are very sacred to people.
Yes.
So, they sort of remained on the fence and they wrote, in the beginning when God began. In the beginning when God began to create. Sorry. It was something like that. Something along those lines, but I could find it. You could look for the NRSV on Genesis 1:1 as I continue my train of thought. Now think about it. And that's because of the word used there, Bereshith, in the Hebrew. Now, if you read it with when God began to create the heaven and the earth, and continue up to verse 30, this is how it would read, right? When God began to create the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, Let there be light. Yeah. So in other words, the verse 1 is more of a result as opposed to the beginning point.
The beginning point, yeah.
So would think about that in today's literature, would think about Genesis 1:1 as the heading, so to speak. Okay? Or the headline. You know, like maybe you had a newspaper and you see something like 5 thieves caught. something like that. I was going to have something more dramatic, but it had death to it. So I said, no, not death. It's a Christian pod. Okay, 5 thieves coat. So it pulls you. Then you're like, in the wake of the morning, okay, last week on Tuesday, this and this place was broken into. So somewhere down, you find something like, and then 5 men have been, caught, in view of that crime. Yeah. And, that's not out of place. And let me show you this. Because if you go to that Genesis chapter 1, let's just stick to King James because it's what is popular to many of us. Because think about it. If I do it like that, if I say Genesis 1:1 is the goal, but before that goal, what was happening? The earth was without form and void, darkness was upon the face of the deep. And have you noticed, it feels as though God's first action is in verse 3. And God said. Okay, so this is what... Okay, now look at chapter 2. Verse 1. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished. That was the goal. See that?
Oh, yes.
Thus the heavens and the earth were finished and all the host of them. So think about it. So when God began to create the heavens and the earth, Genesis 1:1, this and this was happening. So first day, second day, third day, fourth day, fifth day, sixth day. Okay. After that, thus the heavens and the earth were
finished. That was the goal.
Yeah.
From the beginning.
That was the goal. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished. And then, 7th day. Then rest.